Everyone is an editor thanks to social media. This channel illuminates the art form behind the craft. This is Dissecting the Cut. Today's video is on Whiplash. We will be closely comparing the short film with the feature film scene version. If you're interested in watching a full side-by-side view of the short and feature, then check out the video linked below in the description. To begin, why was the short film made?
On these James Gray movies, I met this producer named Cooper Samuelson, and at some point he emailed me and said, "We're trying to get a feature off the ground. It's called Whiplash. We're trying to get the financing, so we're gonna take 20 pages out of the script and we're gonna get a crew and we're gonna shoot a little test." So he sent me the whole script and I loved it. So I met Damien in Silver Lake and we immediately hit it off. We started talking about movies. So it got sent to Sundance and it won Best US Short Film. And then the financing came through for the feature. And I was lucky to be able to do the feature.
Now let's start with some stats. The short film has a runtime of 16 minutes, 30 seconds, and 18 frames. The feature film scene has a runtime of 15 minutes, 20 seconds, and 15 frames. The short has 269 cuts, while the feature has 304. The short has an average of cutting every 3.7 seconds. The feature has an average of cutting every 3 seconds. The first thing you will notice is how the feature scene is shorter by 1 minute, 10 seconds, and 3 frames. It looks like the feature is simply shorter with a quicker pace than the short, but this isn't the case. There are sections where the feature is actually longer than the short. Here's the timeline where both have been dissected and synced together. As you can see, there are gaps in order to keep both in sync. The red markers indicate areas where the feature scene is longer than the short. The blue markers indicate areas where the feature scene is shorter than the short.
Damon, you're done. Gentlemen and ladies, I apologize on behalf of Schaefer Conservatory.
When comparing both the short and feature, the first lesson to learn is how to edit tension. A common misconception is that editing faster is always better. Look at current trends on social media and you will see very fast-paced editing. It can be very engaging and visually dynamic, but too much of it is exhausting to watch. There's a place for fast-paced editing and Whiplash incorporates it, but it also uses slower-paced editing in certain sections of the film for various reasons. One of them being to heighten tension. When it comes to creating tension, slow-paced editing is actually better than fast. A key moment that illustrates this well is when Fletcher is trying to find the out-of-tune player. The feature creates more tension by drawing out the moment longer. The feature scene is a total of 22 seconds longer compared to the short film. A lot of the added tension is in small 2-second chunks, but one that stands out is the first gap in this area. This moment is 8 seconds and 16 frames longer than the short.
Now this one really upsets me. We have an out-of-tune player. Before I go any further, would that player care to identify himself? Maybe a bug flew in my ear. Bar 115. Now this one really upsets me. We have an out-of-tune player here. Before I continue, would that player care to identify himself? No? Okay, maybe a bug flew in my ear. 115.
Seeing this moment back to back from both sources shows clearly how the added 8 seconds and 16 frames to the feature employs more tension compared to the short. This slower pacing is what makes Fletcher so scary.
4 people are sitting around a table talking about baseball, whatever you like. 5 minutes of it, very dull. Suddenly, a bomb goes off, blows the people to smithereens. What do the audience have? 10 seconds of shock. Now take the same scene and tell the audience there is a bomb under that table and will go off in 5 minutes. Well, the whole emotion of the audience is totally different because you've given them that information that in 5 minutes' time, that bomb will go off. Now the conversation about baseball becomes very vital because they're saying to you, don't be ridiculous, stop talking about baseball, there's a bomb under there. You've got the audience working.
You can think of Fletcher as being the bomb in the scene, and the audience can sense it. After the added 22 seconds to this section, the bomb finally goes off, and we see how vicious Fletcher can be. In the book Art of the Cut, Oscar-winning editor Tom Cross talks about how the movie Sicario is a great example of editing tension. He says, "With that film, I see a movie that really was shaped in the editing room. It has beautifully crafted action, but also shows the confident use of time and pace in order to create tension." The sequence showing the convoy crossing the border and driving through the streets of Juarez is elegantly and masterfully constructed. At a glance, the scenes appear expository. The convoy moves from one location to another and could easily have been abbreviated and shortened. However, a choice was made to really inflate the time frame and build anticipation in a very slow and deliberate way. As the convoy navigates the winding streets, it's like a rubber band keeps getting stretched and stretched, and you're just on the edge of your seat waiting for it to snap back. This feeling is caused by an editorial choice. This is why slower editing is better for tension. The slower pace causes the rubber band of tension to stretch. The longer it's stretched, the more satisfying the climax and release of tension will be. A great example to show this is after Fletcher throws a chair at Andrew. We have a small section that is longer in the feature. Fletcher asks if Andrew was rushing or dragging, and in the feature, Andrew takes 2.5 seconds longer to respond.
Were you rushing or were you dragging?
I don't know.
Were you rushing or were you dragging?
I don't know.
This section is significant because it's where the rubber band of tension reaches its breaking point and finally snaps back together. This is shown visually in the next section as Fletcher begins to slap Andrew. The feature cuts this section shorter by 8 seconds and 12 frames. Shorter is better here because it communicates the chaos of the moment as Andrew is emotionally and physically abused by Fletcher. A similar pattern occurs in the earlier example as well when Fletcher is trying to find the out-of-tune player. The tension is stretched and stretched until the breaking point when he brutally yells at the trombone player. At that point, the feature is shorter by 3 seconds and 9 frames. So if you're editing a tense scene, you will want to first edit at a slower pace to draw out the tension, and then when the metaphorical bomb goes off in the scene, you want to suddenly switch to faster paced editing to make the explosion more intense.
Charlie Parker didn't know anybody until Joe Jonas threw a cymbal at his head.
So that's your idea of success, huh?
I think being the greatest musician of the 20th century is anybody's idea of success.
Dying broke and drunk and full of heroin at the age of 34 is not exactly my idea of success.
I'd rather die drunk, broke at 34 and have people at a dinner table talk about me than live to be rich and sober at 90 and nobody remember who I was.
The second lesson to learn is how to edit subjectively. The subjective perspective is a very powerful tool in filmmaking. It's often the reason an audience relates with and identifies with a character. It's how you get an audience to care about what happens to them. The whole Whiplash film is told through Andrew's subjective point of view. This can be seen by how Andrew is literally in every scene of the movie. There are many ways to achieve the subjective point of view, one of them being how a scene is edited.
I always think about the character, and in the case of something like Whiplash, I always think about Andrew. How can I cut it in a way to get into that character's head? And often that has to do with the character's face and that has to do with looks. I think about how powerful the eyes are and the gaze. I think about in Alfred Hitchcock's classic movie Psycho, when the killer is spying on a woman undressing, about to get in the shower. He takes a picture off a wall that reveals a hole in the wall so that he can peek in and look at this woman undressing to go in the shower. We show his eyes looking and then we see what he's looking at. That's very potent, that's very powerful because the audience sees exactly what the character sees, and you have a direct connection to that character's experience. That has an enormous amount of power.
Tom Cross is talking about the Kuleshov effect here. The technique comprises of 3 shots. First, a character looking at something. Second, a shot of what they see. And third, back to the shot of the character reacting to what they just saw. It's a simple technique that can be used to draw the audience into the character's point of view. It's powerful because the audience sees exactly what the character sees, and then more importantly, they see that character's reaction, and that in turn teaches the audience something about the character or situation. A good example to show this is right before Fletcher enters. We see Andrew look up, and then we see the clock. Then we cut to a close-up of the clock, and then we cut to an extreme close-up of the hands ticking exactly 9 a.m. Then we quickly cut back to Andrew's reaction of Fletcher's dramatic entrance. Cutting to Andrew's reaction gives the feeling of seeing the moment through his perspective. In my last video, I explained the difference between collision and linkage styles of editing. The Kuleshov effect is a great example of linkage editing. Collision editing is great and is used many times throughout this scene, but it is the linkage editing moments like this that hold up the character's arc throughout the scene. Another technique in editing subjectively is to simply keep cutting to the character. This is the most used technique in this scene. It's a pretty complicated sequence and has a lot of moving parts. It would be easy to lose Andrew's perspective through all the various moments that take place. Because of this, we cut back to Andrew again and again. These reaction shots help us track Andrew's arc through the scene.
Any scene with a lot of characters is challenging because you have to cut to them to keep their characters alive. You have to keep cutting to them to check in with them. There are challenges with geography, with looks, and this person looking this way and that way. But I would say that you have to reread your scene, think about your story, and think about, is there a main character? Is there a point of view that you want to get across? What's the change from the beginning to the end? Is there any? And if there is, who is it that's changing? That's the person you want to focus on, And if it's two characters in interaction, my suggestion would be to edit the scene with only those characters first. Focus on that, try that, get that interaction, and then go back and look for how you can incorporate the other people into the scene.
You might think Fletcher is the main character because he drives the scene, but it's actually Andrew. The point of the scene is for Andrew to observe Fletcher's unorthodox methods for running his band. A great example to show this is when Fletcher confronts the out-of-tune player. We cut to Andrew's reaction as he is shocked by Fletcher's response. This is a moment where the feature adds a reaction shot. This reaction shot achieves two purposes at the same time. It adds length and draws out the tension of the moment. It also centers us with Andrew's subjective point of view. We then cut back to Andrew while Fletcher yells at the student. Andrew isn't participating in the action happening at that moment of the scene, but he reacts and changes as he experiences Fletcher's rage for the first time as a bystander. Another example of subjective point of view is when Fletcher is talking to Andrew in the hallway. There's a key difference between the short and feature in how the scene ends. The short cuts to a wide shot of Fletcher walking away, while the feature stays on the close-up of Andrew. The feature does a better job with showing Andrew's subjective point of view. The shot of Fletcher walking away is an objective point of view. You can see the difference when the two are side by side. The wide shot of Fletcher walking away makes us feel distant from Andrew, while in the feature we stay on the close-up to see Andrew's reaction. This keeps us with Andrew's perspective and makes it so the audience relates to him more. The placement of the camera matters and how we relate to the character. Camera placement isn't only applicable to directing and cinematography, it's also important for the editor to be mindful of. An editor needs to know how certain shot sizes and angles affect the viewer so that they can cut to the right shot for each moment of a scene.
Please, come on, you're still open. You're still open. Come on. Please, come on.
The The third editing lesson is how to use macro pacing on a scene level. In his book, Art of the Cut, editor Steve Holfish says, "For me, macro pacing deals with the following questions. What is the pace through the major story beats of the film? What is the audience's overall impression of the rate at which the story is told? Does the storytelling itself have a pleasing rhythm to it, with information parceled out at a rate that neither gets too far ahead of the audience or lets the audience get too far ahead of the story?" In my last video, we briefly went over the difference between micro and macro pacing. Often macro pacing is associated with the bigger picture of how the whole film flows, but the smallest form that it can take is the scene level. This is because a key component of macro pacing is story beats, and the smallest form in tracking changing beats is at the scene level. A beat is when a change occurs in the story. This can come from major plot beats, which is when something big changes in the story, like when Andrew is kicked out of studio band. Beats can also come from the scene level, which are often smaller changes. For example, a character could insult another character. Then you will see that scene take a turn in a different direction. When it comes to scene level macro pacing, it's all about the pacing of the scene beats. Here are the beats covered in the short film and feature scene. First, band members arrive. Second, Fletcher arrives. Third, the band plays for the first time. Fourth, Fletcher looks for the out-of-tune player. Fifth, Fletcher berates the trombone player. Sixth, Fletcher talks to Andrew during the break. Seventh, Andrew plays for the first time. Eighth, Fletcher corrects Andrew's drumming. Ninth, Fletcher throws a chair at Andrew. 10th, Fletcher slaps Andrew to prove a point. 11th, Fletcher makes Andrew yell that he's upset. 12th, Fletcher tells Andrew to practice harder. From tracking these beats between the short film and feature scene, we can more clearly see how the macro pacing differs between the two. Here's a timeline of the short film with a marker at every beat of the scene. Here's the same timeline of the feature scene. If I flip between the two, you can see the beats change slightly, just like a flip book. Most of the beats tighten and are slightly closer together, but there are two areas that actually expand. The first is between beat 4 and 5. This section is 22 seconds longer in the feature. We actually already went over this section quite a bit earlier. This is when Fletcher is looking for the out-of-tune player. Earlier, we were focused on the micro pacing, but now you can see how that change in micro pacing affected the macro pacing in this area by moving the fifth beat back by 22 seconds. The second is between beat 9 and 10. This section is 2.5 seconds longer in the feature. We also already went over this a bit earlier. This is after Fletcher throws the chair at Andrew and before he starts slapping him. The 2.5 seconds doesn't seem like much, but it does make a difference. In film, every frame matters. One frame added or taken away makes a difference. Between the second and third beats, Fletcher checks that the band is in tune. In the feature, this section is removed entirely. This cuts out 12 seconds from the feature film, which helps improve the macro pacing by moving the third beat 12 seconds closer to the previous beat. After the sixth beat, Fletcher talks to Andrew in the hallway. Here we have a whole 18 seconds cut out from the feature film because of dialogue being removed from the scene. Cutting out this dialogue helps this scene be more direct to the point. In the book Art of the Cut, Tom Cross says, "Film editing can be challenging because your target is often a moving one. When you start cutting, you're working on scenes. You choose certain takes or pieces that you feel serve the desired story points and emotions. Once you start looking at the broader picture, when everything is assembled together, you might switch out performances because the context has illuminated a piece or moment that feels out of place." A big difference between the short and feature is the feature scene had to flow with the whole feature film, and the short is a standalone piece. Tom Cross is saying that the macro pacing of the whole film can affect the micro pacing. You start editing largely focused on micro pacing because you don't have a full cut of the film yet. But once you have a full cut, then you are able to work on the macro pacing, and that could mean you need to change certain moments because of the context of the whole film. Then when you work on the micro pacing, that in turn affects the macro pacing. As you can see, there's a balancing act between the macro and micro pacing that takes place while editing a film. Finally, here are some interesting insights between the short film and feature scene. Like I pointed out in my previous video, there are hidden cuts used in both the short and feature to help keep up the intensity. The first hidden cut is in both the short film and feature scene. It happens when Fletcher enters and the band members quickly stand up. You can see the cut in the short here. You can also see that the short uses a speed ramp right before the jump cut, and then for the feature the cut is here. The feature also has a speed ramp, but uses it on Andrew's quick head turn instead. The jump cuts and speed ramps used here make the moment slightly more intense. The next hidden cut used is only in the feature scene. It happens when Fletcher is slapping Andrew. There are 2 hidden cuts in this area. You can see one right here, and the other right here. These jump cuts are used to make the slap look harder. This is an editing technique often only used in action films to help make punches more intense and to help sell fake punches to the audience. Another thing action editing does to sell fake punches is to cut to a different angle right before the impact. This can help hide the fact that the punch isn't actually hitting the person. You can see this technique being used here. But the difference is that J.K. Simmons really is slapping Miles in this scene, but he's not slapping that hard. Instead, short speed ramps are used to make it appear like J.K. is slapping really hard. You can see the speed ramp right here. The short also uses speed ramping to make the slaps look harder. It's very subtle, but these slaps are being sped up and then quickly returned to normal speed for the dialogue portions of the shot. There's a good number of shots from the short film that are reused in the feature scene. They are colored differently to match the look of the feature film. This is very resourceful filmmaking on Damien's part. Here are all the shots that are in both the short film and feature scene. I hope you enjoyed today's video. I love the movie Whiplash, but I promise I'm moving on to other Oscar-edited films. And that's a cut.